Our patterns of communication as a society shape our intercultural interactions. As you can imagine, if you come from a culture that tends to communicate very directly, and you are working with somebody from a society where direct communication causes them to lose face in front of others, you may have a problem. This way of communication is described either as high context culture or a low context culture. This framework was originally developed by anthropologist Edward T. Hall. It's best understood as a continuum where cultures are relatively high or low in comparison to each other. A high context culture tends to emphasize and are sensitive to unspoken verbal messages because we assume we have a shared body of knowledge. The interpretation of these messages then are often based on the communicator's mood or other contextual clues. In other words, there is a high dependence on the context to explain. This also means that people tend to communicate indirectly, where yes can mean yes, or no, or maybe, depending on the clues and the cues surrounding that yes. It's about reading the atmosphere. Often this is done in order to help those involved save face and not be embarrassed by direct communication. When interacting with somebody from this culture for the first time, it's important to establish social trust first, as there is a high value placed on personal relationships. Negotiations in this context tend to be slow and ritualistic. Then we have low context cultures who rely on the spoken messages and direct verbal expression. It emphasizes what is actually said. So there's a low reliance on the context to do the communicating. And the meaning of the message is there in the communication itself, because we assume that we don't have the same body of knowledge. In a work context, we tend to see this in a note-taking culture where there's an agenda before the meeting and meeting minutes afterwards. In a low context culture, you're more likely to get down to business first, and expertise and performance is valued and actually made explicit. Negotiations, for example, tend to be more efficient, or there's an emphasis on being efficient and effective. So if you have cultures like the Dutch or the Germans, where direct communication is highly valued and expected, then you might have somebody in the middle with the British or the French culture, and a little bit below that, you might have somebody from the United States. Then we have very high context cultures like Japan and China, where they really read the atmosphere. Erin Meyer, professor and author of the book The Culture Map, tells a great story about her first business meeting in Japan. Here's a clip from her speech.
I had a situation early in my career that got this all started for me, where I was on a trip to Japan with a Japanese colleague, and I gave a short presentation to a group of Japanese participants, and at the end of the presentation I asked them if they had any questions. When I looked at the group, no one raised their hands, so I went to sit down. My Japanese colleague then said to me, "Erin, I think actually there were some questions. Do you mind if I try?" And I said, "Okay, fine." So he then stood up, and again he said, any questions? And again, no one raised their hand. But this time he looked very carefully at the group. "Oh, do you have a question?" And the woman said, "Well, thank you, I do." And she asked a fascinating question. And then he did it again. "Oh, do you have something you'd like to say?" "Yes, thank you, I do." So afterwards I said to him, how did you know that these people had questions? And he said to me, "Well, it had to do with how bright their eyes were." And I thought, wow, they don't teach us that in Minnesota. So then I said, "Well, how do you know how bright their eyes are?" And he said, "Well, in Japan we don't make as much direct eye contact as you do in the West. So when you ask people if they have any questions, most people are not looking at you directly. But a few people in the audience are looking directly at you, and their eyes are bright. And that indicates that they would be comfortable with you calling on them." So the next day I gave another presentation, and again I asked if there were any questions, and again no one raised their hand. But this time I thought, okay, I'll just try. So I did as he'd instructed, and I looked carefully at the group, and I saw, just as he said, that only a couple of people in the room were looking directly at me. And if I really thought about it, well, yes, okay, their eyes were bright.
As you can see here, Erin's story highlights just how subtle the communication can be in a low context culture. How people communicate with one another varies widely from culture to culture. In our fully globalized times, it is more important than ever to understand these differences and where they come from.